Hello, and welcome to this episode of Peace in the Time of a Pandemic, a summer video short series from the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, part of the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame in the United States. I'm Atalia Omer, Professor of Religion, Conflict, and Peace Studies at Notre Dame. I'm joined today by Orly, a prominent Iranian-Israeli journalist writing primarily for the alternative media venues of Local Call and 972 magazine. She's a public intellectual, political and cultural activist, and a translator of Persian literature and poetry into Hebrew. Those labels do not do justice to the breadth of Orly's vocation. The purpose of this conversation, indeed, is to get a bit in depth into what all those titles and labels actually mean and why Orly's work constitutes what I have called in my own work an instance of a hermeneutics of citizenship, by which I mean reimagining the meanings of identity and belonging to the space in non-hegemonic ways and through the margins, hybridities, and what the Chicana theorist Gloria Anzaldúa called the borderlands. So we are here today to discuss Orly's work in the Israel-Palestine region, and to a certain degree with really profound implications more broadly to the Southwest Asia and North Africa region, also known as the Middle East. We are here especially to discuss questions pertaining to the meanings and scopes of solidarity and co-resistance among marginalized communities in Israel and Palestine and globally. For example, the links between Black Lives Matter and in the United States and the Palestinian struggle, Palestinian Lives Matter, and between Mizrahi or Israeli Jews who trace their roots to Arab and Islamic context and Palestinian distinct struggles, but also potentially their common political vision. We will also discuss the importance of cultural activism and why literary translation constitutes a peace-building practice and a political act. Our conversation, I believe, will shed light on the need to think more robustly on the importance of the humanities and arts in conflict transformation. Thank you for joining me today, Orly. How are you?
Very good. Thank you for having me, Atalia.
Okay, so I would like to start with the most immediate question and then moving back with historical, sociological, and cultural depth to questions regarding identity, violence, and peace. So from your understanding, did the context of the pandemic and the public health crisis it has generated contributed to the current consolidation of Netanyahu's government? And how can we understand the relation between the COVID crisis and the annexation program in place or in process? Can you tell us what is new about the annexation and to what degree it is in continuation with long-standing practices and the logic of Jewish supremacy?
Okay, these are big topics.
Yeah.
So first off, I think that the connection between the pandemic and the new coalition, the new Israeli government, is quite obvious. I mean, it's after 3 rounds of elections and after all public opinion surveys showed that Kahol Lavan, blue and white Gantz's list is losing power dramatically, and Netanyahu is getting stronger from one round of election to another. I think that the COVID-19 gave Gantz the perfect excuse to enter a government that basically saved his political life. I mean, if he hadn't done that, he would have just disappeared politically, I assume. And there is a reason for that, because he never presented any coherent political agenda except for just not Bibi, and he ended up sitting with Bibi in the same government. And I think that the idea of annexation, whether it will happen or not, and if it's not certain at this point, there is a big question mark whether or not it's going to even happen. But the idea of annexation fell perfectly into that constellation, because when you put together a government that its components have really nothing in common, then Netanyahu's political interests become the only game in town. Gantz is basically a hostage of those interests, and he cannot stand against anything basically that Netanyahu brings to the table, including the annexation. So the only question right now is whether or not Netanyahu thinks that going ahead with the annexation will serve his political interests or not. That is the only thing that will determine whether or not this is going to happen.
Okay, so so maybe the second part of this question, the big question or set of questions, also is related to maybe I can contextualize it a little bit more. So you gave recently a powerful speech in an anti-annexation protest in Tel Aviv. Could you share with us what was your message from the stage? And also yesterday, and we can link also to this article, there was an English translation of a piece you wrote, came out, it was published in 972 magazine, and the title of the piece is "Giving Palestinian Citizenship Doesn't Make Israel Any Less Colonial." This is regarding the prospect of conferring citizenship on officially annexed Palestinian populations if it were to happen. So what is your main contention in that article, and what was your kind of main message on the stage in Tel Aviv in this anti-annexation protest?
I think that the main message was that you cannot turn stolen land into homeland just by force of arms or unilateral illegal legislation. I mean, that will not turn the stolen land of the West Bank into an Israeli homeland or Zionist homeland or a Jewish homeland. It will still remain stolen land as it is today. I actually think, and I will go back in a minute to the question of citizenship, but going back to what you asked about the pandemic and its connection with annexation. You know, when the pandemic started, Israel immediately, you know, the leadership spoke about state of emergency. Now, this sits very well within the Israeli mainstream consciousness, because we've been in a state of emergency since the establishment of the state in 1948. And in the Israeli terminology, state of emergency connects immediately with militarism, with violation of human rights, of individual rights, collective rights, etc. Because there's always the excuse that, oh, that's a state of emergency, so give the leadership whatever power they need to do, give the army whatever power they need to do. And by the way, in Israel, the mechanism that was used to fight the pandemic was entirely a militaristic one. They brought, and it's just absurd, because people were routing to army jeeps in the middle of the ultra-Orthodox neighborhood cities such as Bnei Brak and ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods in Jerusalem. And those are communities that very much resist the mandatory army service. And all of a sudden, that that is what normality or being normal looks like in the Israeli context, is army jeeps at the heart of cities and neighborhoods. So under the pretext of emergency, you can basically do anything. You can bring the secret services to monitor people's phones under the pretext of fighting the pandemics, and anything goes. You know, Israelis have become so numb or so receptive to the idea that the military and the secret services are inside our collective veins, that nothing, you know, surprise. So the same with the annexation. I mean, when it comes to control through military and control through power, especially over the Palestinians, it remains within the inner Jewish Israeli discourse, whether or not it's good for the Jews or it's bad for the Jews. And I was trying to say at that protest, that demonstration, that it's not an inner discussion. It's, first of all, it's a war crime. It's a violation of international laws. And now I'm going back to what you mentioned about Black Lives Matter. And if you know, understanding that sentence, that concept within the Palestinian context, and if we translate it into Palestinian lives matter, then what do we consider to be life? Is it just the physical existence? It's about more than that. Palestinian lives matter, and Palestinian rights matter, and Palestinian freedom of movement matter, and Palestinian sovereignty and right to self-determination matter, and so on. So basically, that was the main message, I think.
Thank you. So maybe this is a good time to invite you to give a bit of context to the kind of thinking and perhaps unlearning that led to your cultural and political activism and kind of the formation of your own political consciousness and yes, activism around the questions of Palestinian rights and for full equality. And I think it will be of a particular interest for our viewers and listeners to learn about how you see yourself within kind of the long legacy of the Israeli Black Panthers and the significance of your choice to be an active voice within a Palestinian political party with an alternative vision to the dominant discourse about peace, security, and national identity. So kind of like stepping back from the moment, from this particular iteration of the emergency to your own formation and the legacy within which you see yourself working.
I love that term unlearning, because you know, any learning should be preceded by a lot of unlearning.
Yeah.
I grew up in Iran. I was born in Iran, and I immigrated with my family at the beginning of the revolution in 1979. So we came as new immigrants, Oleh Hadash, which has a status in Israel. And like all the other Jewish immigrants, we were I mean, we came to understand very quickly that we need to show our gratitude to Israel, and that is by being more Zionist than the rest of the Israelis, and patriotic, etc. So there was a great process of unlearning. And at the same time, growing up, or maybe at early, as a young adult, I came more and more to sense a certain dissonance between my very rooted and proud Iranian identity, and the way that identity was seen by the Israeli public. And I was, it always amazed me, the level of ignorance, first of all, just complete ignorance when it comes to anything that has to do with Iran, Iran being that black fanatic hole and nothing but. And I know that I came from a civilization of thousands of years, and I know that poetry, and I know that literature, and I know that language, and it didn't sit well. And the more I looked into it, and from that place came my interest, and later on my activism vis-a-vis the Palestinian sphere, because the more I thought about it and read and spoke with wonderful activists such as veteran Black Panthers in Israel, I understood more and more that the roots and the mechanism, the ideology and the mechanism of oppression against and the marginalization of Mizrahim, Jews from Arab and Muslim countries, and the Palestinians are the same. And at its base, it is the colonial logic, and it's the colonial stand. And I always use the wonderful metaphor of the villa in the jungle that was used by Ehud Barak to describe Israel. And it's wonderful because it's not us Mizrahi activists who invented it. It's actually Ehud Barak and other Zionist leaders who compared Israel to be a villa in the jungle being, of course, the Middle East. And I would add a white villa in the jungle. And so if Israel is a villa and the jungle and the Middle East is the jungle, and I am originally, I'm a native of that jungle, so where does it leave me? Where is my place in that villa? And then, those layers, as they peel off, it just reveals itself, the sort of a deal that Zionism, the unspoken, unexplicit deal that Zionism made with the Jewish Mizrahis, that you're not, we cannot keep you out, although we really wanted to. And if you read the protocols of the Israeli governments in the early 50s, you would see how much they didn't want the Mizrahim here. But okay, that is the raison d'etre of Israel. We cannot leave you out, so you're allowed inside. But you will always be suspected of, because of your jungle origins, roots. We will never forget that you are originally from the jungle. You will need to work very hard to prove to us that you're not that kind of Arab, that kind of a native junglist or whatever. And then if you work really, really hard, you can maybe upgrade your place from the cellar to the kitchen of the villa, let's say. Never to the living room. We've never had a Mizrahi prime minister, and we will never, I don't think we will for another 70 years. We've had a woman prime minister. We never had a Mizrahi prime minister. And the Palestinians, of course, are outside altogether. Now, the walls of that villa do not just separate me as an Israeli Jew from the Palestinians, or attempts to separate. It also separates me and us Mizrahim as a collective from our history, our culture, our identity, the most in its deepest sense. And then it becomes very clear that we have a mutual interest to work alongside the Palestinians in order to break down those walls of this imaginary villa, to reconnect Israel, or to connect it for the first time with its Middle Eastern surrounding, and to build another house that will be inclusive of all its inhabitants, based on justice and equality for all.
What do you see are some of the challenges for creating those cross-cutting coalitions among Mizrahim and other marginalized communities, including, of course, the Palestinians?
There are huge, huge obstacles to overcome. It is no secret that, you know, the position that I hold, or the worldview that I just presented, less than 2% of the Mizrahim in Israel share that ideology. And I think that it has many reasons that have to do with, first off, I mean, by being Jewish, and it doesn't matter if you're an Ashkenazi or a Mizrahi Jew, just by being Jewish, you are gaining a lot of the oppression of the Palestinians. Mm-hmm. I mean, it begins with land theft, yeah? I mean, a lot of Mizrahim were able to upgrade themselves into the middle class in the very cheap housing that was offered in the settlements in the West Bank, because they stole the land was free, and Israel had an interest to populate it as quickly as possible. So they offered cheap housing with great transportation inside Israel, so that you don't even feel that you actually live in an illegal settlement in the West Bank. And that was a great opportunity for a lot of Mizrahim to upgrade their living standards in those settlements. Another thing is that, again, what I described, that as a Mizrahi, you always need to prove yourself to be more patriotic and more. When you are mentally in that space, in that place, it is incredibly difficult psychologically to unlearn or to disconnect yourself from that mindset, mm-hmm. and to connect or to join forces with those who you learned your entire life to be your enemy. And when you're and you know, the Israeli food chain, as I call it, is such that the Mizrahim were pushed way down, but they always have the comfort to look down and see somebody else even beneath them, which are the Palestinians, of course. And when you're in such a weak position, your instinct is to try to make links or coalitions with those above you, not those under you, because you want to connect to power. You want to be part of where the power is, because you're so powerless yourself. So political, economical, and psychological obstacles are many that unfortunately prevent those cooperations from happening.
Yeah, so it sounds that what you articulated here partly relates to the point about the Jewish supremacy and the kind of privilege and opportunities it supposedly afford, and this becomes kind of, it prevents the possibility of imagining cross-cutting coalitions across ideational boundaries, and this leads me to your cultural work, your translation work, and I was hoping if you can speak about why you see this this work of translation, working as a translator of Persian literature and poetry, as a form of kind of as political and transformational or transformative potentially. What is your understanding of the relevance of your translation work to this kind of this political transformation and to questions of peace and justice, and kind of reimagining cohabitation in the space? It will also be wonderful if you can share with us whose work specifically you are translating at the moment. and why? What kind of what process went into the selection process?
So I'll start with the first part of the question. Without a doubt, I see my work of translation as my main political activism. It's a cultural activism, but it's political at its core because of two reasons. First, again, it's for me, it's hammering a nail into that wall of that villa, in the sense that it's my very, very modest and small contribution to this aspiration of connecting Israel to its geopolitical surrounding, which is Arab and Muslim, and Iran is part of it. And I think, and I'm doing this both as an Iranian patriot, but also as a very concerned Israeli. I don't think that this ignorance serves us at all. I think that ignorance never serves people or societies. And as an Israeli, I'm very much worried about the level of ignorance when it comes to our immediate surrounding and neighbors in the Middle East. But I'm also doing it as a Mizrahi activist. Because, you know, one of the ways that marginalization of communities is being possible is by first breaking their cultural backbone. And when you have, as a collective, as a community, when they look at you as cultureless, and even worse and more tragic, when they convince you that you are cultureless and you have no culture, then you become sort of dust, or sort of a nothingness that is very easy to manipulate. And since you are nothing, you need to be grateful for whatever crumbs they throw at your way. And you lose the ability to demand your share, not just in the material resources, but in the cultural, in the intellectual, in the spiritual assets and resources and discourse in your country. And I think that this has been a tremendous Mizrahi tragedy, that that our second and third generations lost all connection with the original cultures. The second and third generation of Mizrahis almost completely do not speak Arabic, do not know and do not want to know their culture. That is one of the reasons that we initiated the Mizrahi petition against the nation states.
Can you say a few words of what it is for people who don't know what the nation state law is? Sorry.
Yeah, it's a new law that confirms Israel to be the homeland of the Jewish people and only the Jewish people. It degrades the status of the Arabic language from an official, one of the two official languages of the State of Israel, into, I mean, it strips it of its official language status. And that was the article that we focused on, that's damaging the status of the Arabic language. And it affects not only the Palestinians, it affects Mizrahim as well, and prevents them from holding their culture, which, and history and heritage, which are all in the Arabic language.
What specifically, what work specifically are you working on for the translation?
So I'm very excited about the new, I just finished a translation of one of the prominent, maybe the prominent Iranian intellectual of the 1960s, Jalal Ahmad. Fascinating writer. The book is called The School Principle. And it's a very cynical and sharp critique of the Iranian social structure at the time, and I think that it's amazing to me how relevant it remains, both in Iran and actually in Israel also after so many years. It's a socio-political critique, but it's a novel and beautifully written, and that is supposed to be published soon. And now I'm working on another amazing contemporary Iranian writer who actually escaped Iran, and he lives in Berlin at the moment, and it's about an Iranian political activist that escapes the Iranian regime to Berlin and being hospitalized in a mental institution, and the past keeps hunting him in many different ways. And again, I always choose my translations so that the Israeli reader can learn, or at least think about himself as well, not just about Iran. And I think that that book also is very relevant to the political situation in Israel right now.
Thank you. Thank you, Orly, so much for making the time to share your important work with our audiences. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Atalia. Thank you so much for having me.